Get away from my car. You trying to steal it? You worthless trash!
No, sir, please. I'm the mechanic. Your engine mechanic.
The Billionaire CEO grabbed Miles's hand and held it up to the crowd.
Look. Black. Filthy. You think these belong on a $3 million car?
He shoved Miles to his knees, slapped the back of his head.
Or maybe you could just show me. Try. Fix it and it's yours.
Miles looked up. Victor stopped laughing, grabbed him by the throat.
No. But if you can't, this little shack is done. I'll have it torn down by morning. And you can go beg on the street where you belong.
He let go. Miles gasped, stood up, picked up his wrench. What Victor didn't know was that he just made the most expensive dare of his life. The smoke came without warning. A thin gray thread curling from beneath the hood of the only car on Garrison Avenue worth more than every building on the block combined. The Ashford Veyron prototype, one of 3 in existence, hand-assembled in a sealed lab in Stuttgart by a team of 11 engineers who signed non-disclosure agreements just to enter the room, rolled to a dead stop 40 feet from a garage that hadn't been painted since the Clinton administration. $3.2 million of carbon fiber and titanium. Silent. Smoking. Going nowhere. The driver's door swung open, and out stepped a man who looked like he'd been built in a lab too. Victor Ashford, 32 years old, CEO of Ashford Motors. Net worth $4.6 billion on a slow quarter. He stood 6'2" in custom Berluti Oxfords, crafted from crocodile leather, $2,200 a pair, polished so sharp they caught the sun like black mirrors. His Brioni suit, charcoal gray, double-stitched lapels, had been cut in Rome 6 weeks ago to follow the exact geometry of his shoulders without a single crease daring to form. A Hermes tie sat in a perfect dimple at his throat. Gold cufflinks, 18-karat engraved V.A. A Patek Philippe Nautilus on his left wrist, $180,000, though Victor hadn't paid retail for anything since he turned 25. His skin was tanned, the kind of tan you get from wintering in places that don't have winters. Jaw sharp enough to cut paper. Hair trimmed that morning in a $400 chair 17 floors above Lake Michigan. And his hands. His hands were the tell. Smooth, moisturized. Nails filed into perfect crescents, palms that had never wrapped around a wrench, never felt the bite of a stripped bolt, never carried the permanent black stain of engine grease under the skin. Hands made for signing checks. Hands made for pointing at things other people would fix. He pulled his phone from his breast pocket and dialed. The call connected before the first ring finished. "I need the transport team, now." His voice didn't rise. It lowered, the kind of quiet that makes assistants clear their throats. "The prototype is dead. I don't know why. I don't care why. That's your job. Where I'm standing on the corner of Garrison and 12th in front of some place that looks like a scrapyard, with a door." He listened for 3 seconds. 4 hours. Say that number to me again. Slower. He hung up without goodbye. Victor turned in a slow circle. Cracked asphalt, chain link fences, a laundromat with a dead sign, a bodega with bars on every window, a check cashing place running exchange rates from March. And across the street, a garage, small, 1 bay, a hand-painted sign above the roll-up door, Ingram and Son Auto Repair. The letters had been red once. Now they were the color of dried blood. The S in Son was chipped halfway through. The concrete apron out front, swept clean but cracked in 3 places, told the story of a man who hadn't given up on a place the world forgot a long time ago. An American flag hung from a rusted bracket by the roof edges, frayed to threads barely moving in the heat. Victor stared at it, the way a man stares at a gas station restroom when every other option is 4 hours away. He straightened his tie, tugged each cuff until exactly 1 inch of Egyptian cotton showed at the wrist, and he crossed the street, stepping over a pothole like it might reach up and stain him, and walked through the open bay door into the smell of motor oil, iron shavings, and a lifetime of work done by hand. The light inside the garage was different from the world outside. Amber, warm, filtered through a single window caked with years of road dust and exhaust residue that no amount of Windex would ever fully clear. It fell in a slanted column across the concrete floor, catching the tiny particles of metal shavings that floated in the air like dust in a church. And standing in that light, half-shadow, half-glow, was Miles Ingram. 58 years old, 5'10", shoulders broad from 3 decades of lifting engine blocks, but lean everywhere else, the kind of lean that comes from skipping meals to keep the power bill paid. His skin was dark brown, weathered by sun and years, and the slow erosion of a life lived mostly outdoors or under hoods. His hair, what was left of it, was cropped tight to his skull, salt and pepper, more salt than pepper now. A small scar cut across his right eyebrow, earned from a timing chain that snapped in '94. He never got it stitched. Couldn't afford to. His face was the kind that didn't ask for much. Deep lines around the eyes, a jaw that clenched more often than it spoke. The quiet, steady expression of a man who'd learned a long time ago that the world wasn't going to hand him anything, so he'd better know how to build it himself. But it was the clothes that told the real story. Faded Dickies overalls, navy blue once, now closer to the color of an old bruise, washed so many times the fabric had gone soft and thin at the knees and elbows. A patch on the right chest pocket, hand-sewn, slightly crooked. Grease stains layered over grease stains, black over brown over black. The kind that had soaked so deep into the cotton they'd become part of the weave. Beneath the overalls, a white undershirt that hadn't been white in years, closer to yellow now, closer to the color of old paper. On his feet, red wing steel-toe boots. The left toe was cracked open, the leather split along the seam. The right sole was worn down at an angle, years of standing on his left leg while bracing against engine mounts with his right. The laces had been replaced twice. Different colors. He didn't care. And then the hands. The hands were everything. Thick fingers, wide palms, knuckles swollen from decades of torque and impact. His nails were permanently dark, not dirty, not stained, but changed. The grease had entered the nail beds so many times over so many years that the color had simply become part of him, the way a tattoo becomes part of skin. A scar ran diagonally across the back of his left hand, a razor-thin white line where a fan belt had caught him in 2003. He'd wrapped it in electrical tape and finished the job. A rag, oil-stained, faded red, soft from 1,000 washes, hung over his left shoulder. It had been there so long it had left a permanent shadow on the fabric of his overalls. A habit of 30 years. He reached for it the way most people reach for a breath. The garage around him was small but precise. Every wrench hung on the pegboard in order, smallest to largest, outlined in black marker. so you'd know at a glance if something was missing. Every socket in its tray, every bolt in its jar. The floor was old concrete, cracked, stained, but swept. Swept every morning at 5:45 before the first pot of coffee. A radio on the workbench played something low and brassy. Jazz, maybe, or blues. The kind of music that doesn't need you to listen, but fills the room anyway. On the wall behind the register, a framed photograph, black and white. A younger man, Miles's father, Elroy Ingram, standing in front of this same garage in 1971, the year he opened it. Same sign, same bay, same American flag. Elroy's hands were in his pockets, and he was smiling the way people smile when they've built something that matters. Miles had grown up breathing this air. Fixed his first carburetor at 12. Rebuilt a transmission at 15. By 18, he could diagnose an engine by sound alone, the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat and knows. He heard Victor's shoes clicking on the concrete before he saw him. Crocodile leather on a cement floor makes a sound like someone tapping a courtroom gavel. Miles didn't look up. Not yet. He already knew what kind of man made that sound. Victor stepped into the garage the way a man steps into a puddle already disgusted, already looking for somewhere clean to stand. His eyes moved across the space, the stained floor, the pegboard tools, the cracked window, the radio playing its quiet jazz. He took it all in the way a health inspector takes in a failing restaurant, not looking for what works, but cataloging everything that doesn't. Then his eyes landed on Miles, on the overalls, the grease, the cracked boots, the dark hands still resting on the engine block of a 2004 Honda Civic with 220,000 miles on it. Victor's lip curled. "You work here?" Miles straightened up, wiped his hands on the rag over his shoulder. "I own it." "You own it." Victor repeated the words like they were a joke he didn't get. He looked around again, slower this time, more theatrical. "This? You own this?" 40 years. My father before me." Victor laughed. Not a real laugh. The kind of laugh designed to make the air in a room feel smaller. "Your father built this? Well, that explains a lot." He flicked a finger toward the cracked window. "The apple doesn't fall far from the dumpster." Miles said nothing. His jaw tightened, but his hands stayed still. Victor walked closer. His Berluti shoes clicked against the concrete. He stopped 2 feet from Miles, close enough that the smell of his cologne clashed with the smell of motor oil, like 2 languages arguing. "My car is outside. Dead. Prototype. 1 of 3 in the world." He said it the way people say things they want you to feel small about. "My engineering team is 4 hours out. I need someone to look at it. Not," he glanced at Miles's hands, "that I expect much." "I can take a look," Miles said quietly. "You can take a look," Victor smiled. "The cold kind. You, in your little costume, are going to take a look at a car that costs more than this entire block." They walked outside. The Veyron sat in the afternoon sun, still smoking faintly, its matte black body gleaming like something that had fallen from a world that didn't include this street. Victor's 2 engineers had arrived in a black SUV, both in pressed slacks and company polos, both carrying laptops and diagnostic tablets. They stood beside the car like bodyguards. Miles approached the hood. He didn't touch it yet. He just looked, tilted his head, listened. His eyes moved across the body lines the way a reader's eyes move across a sentence, catching rhythm, catching breaks. Then something happened in his face. A flicker. A micro-expression that lasted less than a second, the kind of recognition you see when someone walks into a room they built but hasn't visited in 20 years. Nobody noticed. Well, Victor crossed his arms. Any thoughts? Or are you just going to stand there and admire something you'll never afford? Pop the hood, Miles said. Excuse me? Pop the hood, please? Victor stared at him. Then he reached through the open window and pulled the release. The hood clicked open. Miles lifted it, looked inside, and went very still. The engine bay of the Ashford Veyron prototype was a cathedral of engineering. Twin-turbo hybrid, dual electric motor assist, custom ECU mapping, integrated thermal management. It was the kind of engine that engineering students studied in textbooks. The kind that made other manufacturers send spies to auto shows. Miles stared at it the way a father stares at a child he hasn't seen in decades. His hands hovered over the components, not touching, just remembering. Victor's phone rang. He turned away to answer it, barking orders at someone about insurance coverage and towing permits. While his back was turned, one of the engineers leaned toward Miles. "Don't take it personally," the engineer whispered. "He's like that with everyone." Miles didn't respond. He was still looking at the engine. "I know what's wrong," he said. Not to the engineer, not to anyone. Just out loud, the way a man talks to himself when the truth is too big to hold inside. Victor finished his call and turned back. "So, what's the diagnosis, doctor?" He said the word doctor the way you'd say clown. "Dual valve misfire, pressure regulation offset, firmware conflict in the ECU mapping between your legacy system and the new thermal layer." Silence. The two engineers looked at each other. Victor blinked. "What did you just say?" "I said I know what's wrong, and I can fix it." Victor's mouth opened, then closed. Then opened again, this time with something between a grin and a sneer. "You know what? Go ahead. Try. Fix it, and it's yours." He laughed, the sharp, barking kind. $3 million. All yours. Miles looked at him. Steady. "You serious?" Victor stopped laughing. He stepped forward, grabbed Miles by the throat, and pulled him close. Close enough that Miles could count the threads in Victor's silk tie. "But if you can't, this little shack is done. I'll have it torn down by morning, and you can go beg on the street where you belong." He let go. Miles stumbled back half a step, caught his breath, and reached for his wrench. Miles rolled up his sleeves, not fast, not with any kind of drama. The way a man rolls up his sleeves when the work in front of him is the only thing left in the world that makes sense. The faded fabric of his overalls bunched at his elbows, revealing forearms roped with veins and tendon, the kind of arms that don't come from gyms, but from years of pulling, torquing, and holding things in place while the world tried to shake them loose. He leaned into the engine bay of the Ashford Veyron prototype and disappeared up to his shoulders. Victor watched from 10 feet away, arms crossed, phone still in his hand like a weapon he might need at any moment. His two engineers, Nathan Webb and Craig Sorensen, both in their late 20s, both in pressed Ashford Motors polos and clean khaki slacks, stood closer. Nathan had a diagnostic tablet in his hands. Craig held a laptop connected to the car's OBD2 port by a cable that probably cost more than Miles's monthly rent. "He's not even using diagnostic software," Nathan murmured to Craig. Not whispering, not trying to hide it. The kind of voice people use when they've already decided someone can't hear things that matter. Miles heard. He didn't respond. He was listening to something else. His ear was 3 inches from the intake manifold. His eyes were closed. His left hand rested on the coolant line, not gripping, just feeling. The way a doctor places a hand on a patient's chest, not to push, to listen. The engine was cold and dead, but Miles wasn't listening to the engine. He was listening to the absence, the silence where sound should have been, the gap between what this machine was built to do and what it was doing now, which was nothing. He opened his eyes, moved his hand to the pressure regulation valve, pressed his thumb against the housing, rotated it 1 degree, then another, then stopped. 2 millimeters off, he said quietly. Nathan looked up from his tablet. What? The pressure regulation valve. It's offset by 2 millimeters. Factory spec is 42.5 psi at idle. This one's sitting at 44.1. That's your first problem. Craig typed something, checked a screen. His eyebrows moved before his mouth did. That's actually within the range we flagged last Tuesday, Craig said to Nathan. But we ruled it out because the ECU wasn't throwing a code for it. It wouldn't, Miles said, still not looking at them. He had moved to the wiring harness behind the firewall. His fingers traced the cables the way a blind man reads Braille, not searching, but confirming what he already knew. The ECU can't flag what it can't see. Your ground wire, right here. He pinched a cable between his thumb and forefinger. Is oxidized, corroded at the terminal. It's giving the thermal sensor a false reading, which means the ECU thinks the engine is running 15 degrees cooler than it actually is, so it never triggers the pressure fault. Nathan set his tablet down. That's your second problem, Miles continued. He pulled himself out from under the hood, grease on his jaw, sweat on his forehead. His dark eyes moved to the laptop in Craig's hands. Pull up the firmware version. Craig hesitated, looked at Victor, who was still on the phone, pacing, not paying attention. Then he turned the laptop toward Miles. Miles read the screen for 4 seconds. You're running 2 firmware layers, the original hybrid control architecture from 2001 and the new thermal management overlay from last year. They're conflicting. The legacy system is sending idle state commands that the new layer is interpreting as active throttle inputs. That's why the car stalls under load and won't restart clean. Craig stared at the screen, then at Miles, then at Nathan. We spent 6 days on this, Nathan said. His voice had changed. The condescension was gone, replaced by something closer to the sound a man makes when he realizes he's been standing next to a building he thought was a shed and it turns out to be a cathedral. 6 days, 3 engineers, 2 full diagnostic sweeps. We couldn't isolate the firmware conflict. You were looking at the new system, Miles said. The problem isn't in the new system, it's in the old one. The original architecture was designed to... He stopped himself, looked down at his hands, flexed his fingers, then closed his mouth and reached for a socket wrench from the pegboard. Never mind how I know, he said. I know. Victor finished his call and walked back. His shoes clicked on the concrete like a countdown. Well, are we done playing mechanic, or do you need another hour to figure out which end of the wrench to hold? 3 problems, Miles said, not looking up. Pressure valve offset, corroded ground wire, firmware conflict. I can fix all 3. Sure you can. Victor smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, doesn't even try. Sure you can. He turned to Nathan. Is any of what he said even real? Nathan swallowed. Sir, his diagnosis was correct on all 3 points. Our team in the lab missed the firmware conflict entirely. Victor's smile didn't disappear, but something behind it did. He turned back to Miles, watched those dark, grease-stained hands reach for a torque wrench with the certainty of a man who'd done this 10,000 times. And for the first time since he stepped out of that car, Victor Ashford didn't have anything clever to say. Victor made the call from the sidewalk. He paced back and forth in front of the garage with his phone pressed hard against his ear, his free hand cutting the air like a blade. His voice carried through the open bay door, not because he was shouting, but because Victor Ashford had never learned the difference between talking and performing. He's touching the car, right now. Some nobody in a grease suit is inside the engine bay of a $3 million prototype, and nobody thought to stop him. A pause. I don't care if his diagnosis was correct. I didn't authorize this. Pull the plug. Inside the garage, Miles was already working. He had the pressure regulation valve disassembled on a shop towel, each component laid out in order like surgical instruments. His hands moved with a patience that looked slow to anyone who didn't know what they were watching. But Craig knew. He'd been watching for 12 minutes now, and he hadn't blinked in the last 3. He's not guessing, Craig whispered to Nathan. He knows the valve assembly sequence by heart. That's not in any manual. Victor ended his call and walked back into the bay. His face was tight, jaw locked, the kind of expression a man wears when his ego has been dented, and he's looking for someone to pay for the bodywork. Stop. Miles didn't stop. He was holding the valve housing with his left hand and threading a calibration pin with his right, the kind of two-handed precision that takes years to develop and seconds to ruin. I said stop. Victor stepped closer. Put it down. Now. You're done. Miles paused, looked up. You gave me the dare. I'm honoring it. I gave you a joke. You took it literally. That's not my problem. Miles set the valve housing down gently, wiped his hands on his rag, slow, deliberate, the way a man does when he's choosing his next words carefully, because the wrong ones will cost him his shop. Your engineers confirmed the diagnosis, Miles said. All 3 points. You heard them. I heard 2 kids who've been of grad school for 18 months try to sound impressive. That doesn't mean I trust a... Victor stopped, caught himself, chose a different ending. A backyard mechanic with my property. The word he swallowed hung in the air anyway. Everyone heard it. Nathan looked at the floor. Craig suddenly needed to check something on his laptop. Miles had heard that silence before, many times. The silence where the word nobody says is louder than anything they do say. He reached for the valve again. I'm going to finish the job, he said, not asking, not angry, just stating a fact the way gravity states a fact. Victor grabbed his wrist. You touch that car again without my permission and I'll have you arrested for vandalism. Try me. Miles looked down at Victor's hand on his wrist. The smooth, manicured fingers wrapped around the scarred, grease-darkened skin. The $180,000 watch inches away from a forearm that hadn't seen a doctor in 6 years. He didn't pull away. He just looked at Victor and waited. Something about that stillness, that absolute refusal to flinch, to beg to react, made Victor let go. And in that silence, Miles felt something shift inside his own chest. A door he'd locked 25 years ago rattled on its hinges. He tried not to open it. But the engine on the shop towel in front of him was a key that fit too perfectly. 25 years ago, Miles Ingram had not been a mechanic. He had been lead engineer of the Hybrid Systems Division at Ashford Motors, employee number 0041. The man who designed the original dual-motor architecture that every Ashford vehicle since 2001 had been built on. The man who wrote the firmware by hand, line by line, that became the foundation for a technology now valued at $1.2 billion in licensing alone. He had been the only black engineer in the senior division. The only one who came from a shop instead of a university. And for 3 years, that had been fine, because the work spoke for itself, and the work was brilliant. Then, Reginald Ashford Victor's father decided that the company's image needed refining. A certain look, he'd told the board. A certain standard. He never said the word. He didn't need to. The result was the same. Miles was terminated. His patents were reassigned. His name was removed from every internal document, every press release, every technical journal. 22 patents, 15 provisional filings, 3 years of his life erased like a typo. He fought it for 6 months, hired a lawyer he couldn't afford, filed complaints with every agency that would listen. Nobody listened long enough. He went home. To this garage, to his father's tools, to the only place that had never asked him to be anyone other than who he was. And he stayed. 25 years. Now the engine he'd designed was sitting on a shop towel in front of him, broken, and the son of the man who'd stolen his work was standing 3 feet away, calling him a backyard mechanic. Miles picked up the calibration pin. His hands weren't shaking. They never shook. That was the thing about hands that had been through everything. They didn't waste energy on trembling. They saved it for the work. I'm going to finish the job, he said again. This time, Victor didn't stop him. Miles didn't start with the wrench. He started with his hands. He placed both palms flat on the fender of the Ashford Veyron, fingers spread, thumbs resting on the seam where the hood met the body, and stood there for 5 full seconds. Not praying, not thinking, feeling. The way a pianist touches the keys before the first note, the way a surgeon rests a hand on the table before the first cut. Then he picked up his tools and went to work. The first task was the pressure regulation valve. He'd already identified the 2mm offset during the diagnosis. Now he had to fix it. And fixing it on this engine wasn't like fixing it on any other engine on the planet. The Ashford Veyron's valve assembly was nested inside a thermal housing that sat between the twin turbochargers, accessible only by removing 3 layers of heat shielding and disconnecting the intercooler feed line. A factory-trained technician with the proper tools and a lift would need 90 minutes. Miles, lying on his back on a creeper that was older than Nathan and Craig combined, did it in 22. He didn't rush. Every movement had a purpose. His left hand held the housing steady, while his right threaded the recalibrated pin into the seat, turning it with a precision that made Craig stop typing and just watch. "How is he measuring that?" Craig whispered. "He doesn't have a micrometer." "He doesn't need one," Nathan said quietly. Both men were standing now, laptops forgotten at their sides. Miles's fingers were the micrometer. 30 years of muscle memory had encoded tolerances into his fingertips, the way a watchmaker's hands learned the width of a spring. He could feel the difference between 42.5 and 42.6 psi, the way most people feel the difference between hot and warm. He seated the valve, torqued the housing, moved on. The second task was the corroded ground wire. He pulled himself out from under the car, walked to his workbench, and opened a drawer. Inside, a soldering iron from 1998, a roll of silver solder, a wire stripper with a taped handle. Tools that any of Victor's engineers would have thrown away a decade ago. Miles cut the corroded section with the wire stripper, stripped a 1/4 inch of fresh copper, heated the soldering iron until the tip glowed. And then, in a motion so fluid it looked like handwriting, he joined the new connection to the terminal block. Craig held his phone up. Recording. "The solder joint," he said to Nathan, without looking away from the screen. "Look at it. It's perfect. Concave profile. No cold joints, no bridging. That's not backyard work. That's aerospace." Miles pretended not to hear, but something in the corner of his mouth moved, not a smile, not quite. More like the ghost of something he hadn't felt in 25 years. Pride that someone noticed. He plugged the ground wire back into the thermal sensor harness and checked the resistance with a multimeter that had a cracked screen but still read true. The numbers confirmed what his hands already knew. 2 down. The third task was the one that mattered. The firmware conflict. The thing that had stumped Victor's entire engineering department for a week. The ghost in the machine that no diagnostic tool could find because the diagnostic tools were built on the same flawed architecture. Miles walked to Craig's laptop. "May I?" Craig hesitated for half a second. Then he turned the screen toward Miles and stepped aside. Miles sat down on the metal stool. His oil-stained fingers hovered over the keyboard. The contrast almost absurd. Grease-darkened nails over clean white keys, scarred knuckles over brushed aluminum. A man who looked like he belonged under a car, typing code like he belonged in a lab. Because he once had. Miles opened the terminal, pulled up the ECU source code, and began to type. Not copy, not reference, not search. Type. From memory, line by line. Characters flowing from his fingertips like water from a source that had never stopped running, even when the world had sealed it shut. He wrote a bridge function 12 lines of code that reconciled the legacy idle state protocol with the new thermal management layer. 12 lines that told the old system and the new system how to speak to each other. 12 lines that 3 engineers with master's degrees and $40,000 worth of equipment hadn't been able to figure out in 6 days. He wrote them in 4 minutes. Nathan leaned over the screen. His face went pale. "This is the original architecture," he said. His voice had dropped to something barely above a breath. "The original command structure. Nobody writes like this anymore. This syntax, it's from the first-gen hybrid control system. The one in the archives. The one—" He stopped, looked at Miles, then back at the screen, then at Miles again. "Who are you?" Nathan asked. Miles didn't answer. He hit enter, saved the file, closed the laptop. Through the open bay door, the late afternoon sun had turned the color of honey. It fell across the garage floor in a long rectangle of amber light, catching the sweat on Miles's forearms, the steel of his tools, the oil-stained rag still draped over his shoulder. Victor was leaning against his SUV phone in hand, watching from the sidewalk. He hadn't come back inside, but he hadn't left either. And his face, the face that had laughed, sneered, threatened, grabbed, was still. Perfectly still. The kind of still that happens when a man begins to suspect he's been wrong about something important. Miles closed the hood, not with a slam, with a click. The way a jeweler closes a case, the way a surgeon places the last suture. Precise, final, done. He wiped his hands in the rag one last time, folded it and set it on the fender. Then he stepped back and looked at the Ashford Veyron the way a man looks at something that used to be his. "Try it," he said. Victor hadn't moved from the sidewalk for the last 40 minutes. He'd watched the whole thing, the valve reassembly, the soldering, the coating through the open bay door, arms crossed, phone in his pocket. For the first time all day, he hadn't spoken, hadn't interrupted, hadn't made a single call. Now he pushed himself off the SUV and walked toward the car. His Berluti shoes clicked on the concrete, but the sound was different now, slower, quieter. The gavel had lost its confidence. "Try it," Miles said again. Victor opened the driver's door and sat down. The leather seat adjusted to his weight with a whisper. The dashboard glowed soft blue. Every screen, every gauge, every indicator, waiting for the signal. He reached for the ignition. His hand stopped. For the first time in his adult life, Victor Ashford hesitated before turning a key. Not because he thought it wouldn't work, because somewhere in the back of his mind, behind the ego, behind the suit, behind 32 years of never being wrong, he was beginning to suspect that it would. And if it did, everything he'd said in the last 3 hours would land on him like a verdict. He turned the key. The engine caught on the first rotation. Not a cough, not a stutter, not the grinding hesitation of a machine fighting its way back to life. A sound like a held breath released, smooth, deep, immediate. The twin turbos spooled in perfect unison. The hybrid motors engaged without a whisper of delay. The exhaust note settled into a low, steady hum that vibrated through the garage floor and into the soles of Miles's cracked boots. The dashboard lit green. Every single indicator, every sensor, every system. Green, 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 green. Nathan was already running diagnostics on his tablet. His fingers moved across the screen, pulling data, checking baselines, comparing before and after. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. "Everything's nominal," he said. Then, correcting himself, "Everything's better than nominal. The thermal efficiency is up 3% from factory spec. The idle RPM is smoother than when it rolled off the line." He didn't just fix it. He optimized it. Craig looked up from his laptop. "The firmware bridge is clean. No conflicts. No error codes. The legacy system and the new layer are communicating perfectly. It's like they were always meant to work together." "They were," Miles said quietly. "That was the original design." Nobody asked what he meant. Nobody needed to. Victor sat in the driver's seat for a long time, the engine running, the air conditioning breathing cold air onto his face, the steering wheel under his perfect, manicured hands. He stared through the windshield at the back wall of the garage, at the pegboard tools, the cracked window, the photograph of Elroy Ingram in 1971. Then he turned the engine off. The silence that followed was louder than anything that had happened all day. He got out of the car, slowly, closed the door with the same careful click Miles had used on the hood, stood in the bay, hands at his sides, and looked at Miles. Miles looked back. No triumph in his face, no smugness, no vindication, just the calm, steady expression of a man who had done what he said he would do. "How?" Victor said. One word, but it carried the weight of every insult, every threat, every crumpled bill, every grabbed throat, every spat-on floor. "How did you know the original architecture?" Miles was quiet for a moment. He picked up his rag, draped it over his shoulder, and looked at Victor the way a teacher looks at a student who just asked the first real question of the semester. "Because I wrote it." 2 words. And the garage went silent enough to hear the flag outside rustling in the evening breeze. Nathan was already on his phone, typing, scrolling, his face changing with every swipe, the way a face changes when a man reads something that reorganizes everything he thought he knew. "Miles Ingram," Nathan read aloud. His voice was unsteady. "Lead Engineer Hybrid Systems Division, Ashford Motors, 1998 to 2001. 22 patents, 15 provisional filings. Primary architect of the dual-motor hybrid control system." He looked up. "Terminated." The word sat in the air like a stone dropped into still water. Craig looked at the engine, then at Miles, then at the engine again. "He designed this. He designed the thing we've been trying to fix for a week. He designed the whole system." Victor's face had gone white. Not the white of fear, the white of a man standing in front of a mirror he's been avoiding for 32 years. "Terminated," he repeated, quiet, almost to himself. "Why?" Miles held his gaze. "You should ask your father." The sun had dropped below the roofline of the garage. The amber light was gone, replaced by the pale blue of early evening. The American flag outside had gone still. The radio on the workbench had shifted from jazz to something slower, a piano playing something that sounded like it was remembering a song it used to know. Miles didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The engine he'd built had spoken for him. The code he'd written had testified. And the son of the man who'd erased him was standing in his garage, looking at his hands, finally understanding what they were worth. Nobody moved for a long time. The garage held its breath. Nathan's phone screen had gone dark in his hand, but he hadn't noticed. Craig was leaning against the workbench with his arms crossed, staring at the concrete floor like the answer to something was written there. The Ashford Veyron sat between them, all engine off, still warm, ticking softly as the metal cooled. The only sound in the room besides the radio, which had gone quiet between songs. Victor stood 6 feet from Miles. The distance between them had never felt smaller and never felt wider at the same time. "Why didn't you fight it?" Victor said. His voice was different now, lower, stripped of the polish, the performance, the boardroom baritone he used to fill rooms. What was left sounded younger, uncertain, almost human. 22 patents. Your entire body of work. They took it. Why didn't you sue? Go public. Burn it all down. Miles looked at him for a long moment. Then he pulled the metal stool from the workbench, sat down, and rested his forearms on his knees. The posture of a man about to say something he hasn't said out loud in a very long time. "I tried." "You tried?" 6 months. Lawyer I couldn't afford. Every agency I could find. Filed complaints, wrote letters, showed up to offices where they looked at me like I was lost. He paused, rubbed his thumb along the scar on the back of his left hand. You know what happens when a black mechanic from the South Side accuses a billion-dollar company of stealing his work? Nothing. That's what happens. Nothing. Victor opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. My father. Your father didn't fire me because I couldn't do the job. He fired me because I could, better than anyone in the building. And that was the problem. Because a man like your father could accept a black man mopping his floors, driving his cars to the lot, carrying boxes to the loading dock. But sitting in the senior engineering room, writing the code that would define his company for the next 25 years. Miles shook his head. That was too much. That was a different kind of threat. The words hung in the garage like smoke. Victor turned and walked 3 steps toward the bay door. Stopped. Put his hands in his pockets. Took them out. Put them back. The restlessness of a man who can't find a comfortable position inside his own skin. The car, he said, finally turning back. The dare. $3 million. It's yours. I'll have the title transferred by... I don't want your car. Victor blinked. What? I don't want your car, son. The word son landed different from the way Victor had said boy 4 hours ago. It didn't cut. It didn't mock. It was the word a man uses when he's looking at someone younger and seeing for the first time not an enemy, but a mistake that still has time to be corrected. Then what do you want? Victor asked. And for the first time he was asking, not demanding, not performing, not negotiating. Asking. The way a person asks when they realize they owe a debt that money can't cover. Miles stood up, walked to the back wall of the garage, stood in front of the photograph of his father, Elroy Ingram, 1971, hands in his pockets, smiling in front of the shop he'd built with a GI Bill loan and 14-hour days. I want you to say my name. What? I want you to say my name, in a room full of people, into a microphone. I want the world to know who built the engine that built your company. Not because I need the credit, but because your father made sure nobody would ever know. And that, his voice caught for just a second, the first crack in the calm he'd held all day. That was the part that hurt. Not the money, not the job. The erasing. Like I was never there. Victor looked at Miles. Then at the photograph behind him. Then at his own hands, smooth, clean, perfect. The hands that had never built anything. The hands that had grabbed this man's throat 3 hours ago. He pulled out his phone, dialed. The call connected on the second ring. It's Victor. I need an emergency board meeting, tonight. A pause. No, it can't wait until Monday, because I just found out something about our company that can't wait another hour, let alone another weekend. He hung up, looked at Miles. I'll say your name, he said, in front of every board member, every shareholder, every camera I can get in the room. I'll say it so loud my father hears it from whatever golf course he's rotting on. Miles nodded, slow, once. The kind of nod that carries more weight than most speeches. He reached down and picked up the crumpled $100 bill that was still lying on the garage floor, smoothed it flat against his thigh, folded it once, and held it out to Victor. You dropped this. Victor looked at the bill, then at Miles's hand, the dark, scarred, grease-stained hand that had just saved his car, his company, and something inside him that he didn't have a name for yet. He didn't take it. "Keep it," Victor said. "Frame it. Put it next to your father's picture." Miles looked at the bill, looked at the photograph, and for the first time all day, he smiled. It was small, barely there. The kind of smile that lives in the eyes more than the mouth. But it was real. And it was 25 years overdue. 2 weeks later, Victor Ashford stood at a podium in the grand ballroom of the Ashford Motors headquarters in Detroit. 300 people, board members in the front row, journalists along the sides, camera crews from 4 networks lining the back wall. The Ashford Motors logo glowing on a screen behind him, the same logo that had been on the building for 41 years, without ever once being associated with the name Miles Ingram. Victor wore a suit, a different one this time, simpler, no cufflinks, no Patek Philippe. He'd left the watch in the car. He didn't say why. He adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat, and said the name. Miles Ingram. The room was quiet. In 1998, a man named Miles Ingram walked into our engineering division and built the hybrid system that every vehicle in this company has been based on for the last 25 years. 22 patents, 15 provisional filings, the original firmware architecture. All of it his. He paused. The kind of pause that costs something. In 2001, my father terminated him. Removed his name from every document, every patent, every record. Not because of his performance, because of his race. The room didn't gasp. It went cold. The kind of cold that happens when 300 people inhale at the same time and forget to exhale. Today, Ashford Motors is formally restoring all 22 patents to Miles Ingram's name. We are issuing full retroactive royalty payments for 25 years of licensing revenue. And our newest line, the one shipping next quarter, will carry his name. The Ingram series. A photograph appeared on the screen behind Victor. Not a corporate headshot. The photograph from the garage wall. Elroy Ingram, 1971, smiling in front of the shop he built. Next to it, a new photograph. Miles standing in the same spot, same pose, same shop. Same hands in the same pockets, same smile. 55 years apart. The room stood. Not all at once, the way applause starts when it's real. One person, then 3, then a row, then the room. Not polite, not obligatory. The kind of standing ovation that happens when people realize they're witnessing something that matters more than whatever they came for. Miles wasn't in the ballroom. He was at the garage. Same overalls, same boots, same rag on his shoulder. He'd been invited. He'd declined. Said he had a '97 Camry with a timing belt issue that wasn't going to fix itself. He watched the press conference on the small television mounted above his workbench, the one with the rabbit ears and the crack across the bottom left corner. He watched Victor say his name. Watched the room stand. Watched his father's photograph fill the screen. He didn't cry. Miles Ingram didn't cry. But his hands stopped moving for a moment. Just a moment. And he looked at them, those dark, scarred, grease-stained hands, and he nodded. Once. Slow. Like he was saying something to someone who wasn't in the room anymore. Then the Camry's owner honked outside, and Miles picked up his wrench. The shop was open. The work was waiting. And for the first time in 25 years, the name on the sign out front meant exactly what it was supposed to mean. Have you ever been judged for how you look before anyone saw what you could do? Drop your story in the comments. I read every single one. And if this hit you the way it hit me, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Subscribe. Stay, because the next story might be yours.
25 years, that's how long my Ingram name would erase from the engine his own hand built, not because he failed, because he succeeded. In a room that wasn't ready for him, Victor's father didn't steal my work because it was worthless. He stole it because it was irreplaceable. Another thing about your talent, you can take the credit, you can take the title, but you cannot take the knowing. My walked back to his father's garage and kept building, not for applause, not for revenge. Because the man who knows what his hands are worth doesn't need someone else to tell him. And 25 years later, the engine still knew its maker, even when the company had forgotten his name. So here's what I want you to see with tonight. If your name were removed from everything you ever built, would you still know who you are? And who in your life right now is carrying brilliance the world has refused? Drop your story in the comment. I read everyone. Subscribe if you are staying, and share this with someone who been overlooked, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply say their name